Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us at the Singapore International Cyber Week today. Just a friendly reminder for all our guests to please switch your mobile devices to silent mode to avoid causing disruption to the session later. Thank you so much. Hi again, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us at the SANS Expo and Convention Center today. A quick and friendly reminder, please switch your mobile devices to silent mode to avoid causing disruption to the session later. Also, the session will include a Q&A, so stay with us and take this opportunity to interact with the speakers live. For in-person audience, please scan the QR code on the screens or at your seats to participate in this segment. Your health and safety is our top priority. As our safe management measures guidelines have eased, masks are not required to be worn during the session. However, should you feel unwell, please seek medical attention immediately. Thank you. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Singapore International Cyber Week 2022. I'm Jamie, your host for this afternoon. We have an exciting lineup of speakers with us here today to share their perspectives on the theme, Internet or Splinternet, implications for securing the digital future. We would like to encourage our physical audience here in the studio today to post your questions later during the panel discussion. We will have our mic runners run to you with microphones. Now, recent global events have highlighted the outlook of an increasingly fragmented global internet system. This has raised the risk of the internet developing into so-called splinternets, where instead of a single global internet, there could be a multitude of regional and national internet-like networks that are isolated from one another and potentially using incompatible technologies. Today, our session aims to stimulate discussion on how the public and private sectors can collaborate to address the potential challenges and mitigate the risks posed by a fragmented internet. We'll be covering the fragmentation of the internet and discussing ways on how we can shape the future of the internet. Without further ado, though, please join me in welcoming Mr. Olaf Kolkman, Principal, Internet Technology, Policy and Advocacy, Internet Society, to share with us on trends and cybersecurity risks of Splinternet. Dr. Olaf, please.
Quite a stage this is. Thank you. Splinternet and security. So somewhere in the announcement that we just heard, we heard the sort of assumption that the Splinternet will happen, that we will have a fragmented internet. And I think that is something that we should consider twice. When we talk about Splinternet and the internet, we have to assert some values, I think. And the first value that I want to assert is that the open, global, secure, and trustworthy internet is a driver for social and economic prosperity. If we lose the internet, we lose that driver. And I think if we talk in terms of security, that is actually a risk to society. Not to individual companies, not to individual governments, but a risk to society as a whole. As we digitize, the internet is incredibly important to make the connections that we all rely on. What is that value? So if you think about Splinternet, then one way of thinking about this is fragmentation. And one way to think about fragmentation that happens today, is internet shutdowns. Internet shutdowns happen in some countries for various policy reasons. There might be an exam and the policymakers are afraid that cheating is going on, and hence they shut down the internet for a complete country for a day, maybe 2 days. To size that cost, the cost of that type of shutdown is enormous. I mean, let's face it. I see a couple of people already on their phones. They're probably on the internet now. Losing the internet for 5 minutes, probably doesn't impact you that much. Losing it for a day is actually pretty painful. There is a company called an organization called NetBlocks, and they have an app on the web that calculates the costs of a shutdown for nations. And I ran the app this morning for Singapore, and if you turn off the internet in Singapore for 1 day, the cost to the economy is 210 million Singapore dollars. So that's the cost of fragmentation. That's the economic and social prosperity. Now, what is fragmentation, or what is the Splinternet? And there are so many definitions about it. But in order to, I'm going to tell you how I think about the internet. The internet to me is a network of networks that together provide you this global connectivity. So it's a fairly technical assessment. At the Internet Society, we have listed a number of critical properties that make the internet the internet. If you have those critical properties, you have the internet. If you deteriorate them, if you remove yourself from them, then you get into Splinternet area. And where Splinternet starts, or real fragmentation starts, that is a sliding scale. You know, if you have a beam and you take a splinter off, nobody will notice. If you take 2 splinters off, nobody will notice. But if you take too many splinters off, the beam might crack and hence fragment. I'm not going to go through these critical properties. That's a talk by itself. But with these critical properties, you can look at policy proposals and assess whether they come closer or further away from a potential splinternet. Now, one of the things that I was asked to talk about is the impact of a splinternet, or splintering on the internet, on security. So I looked at that a little bit, and it's usually useful to think about the internet architecture as a layered system. That's how, and this is a fairly engineering slide, I realize. But the internet is a network of networks. And so on the lower layers, which we call the physical layers, you have individual networks. And per definition, they're fragmented, because one network doesn't make an internet. Well, per definition, they're fragmented. On the other hand, there is no fragmentation if it comes to, for instance, Ethernet. I can bring my laptop or my phone and connect here in Singapore to the internet using the same technology as I use at home. Should you have fragmentation there, you need different handsets and so on and so forth. We all remember this from different phone technologies way back when. On the content and transaction layer, there is also a myriad of fragmentations and risk of fragmentation. Blocking of social media, sovereignty requirements in order to satisfy national security policy. Things to control speech or IP violation or what have you. A number of valid policy concerns might limit the things that you can do on the internet. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you impact the internet itself by that. But often the way that people implement these measures impact the very fabric of the internet itself. The routing system, the IP addresses, the DNS, and infrastructures like the certificate infrastructure that you need for encryption. And once you do that, once you impact those technologies, they have a flowing effect. If you split the DNS, then if I want to connect to my bank here, I end up at a different bank than back home. Once you put in a certificate because you want to intercept traffic, that has a global effect too. You break encryption for the whole globe. If you filter certain IP ranges, you might actually be filtering services that we all depend on, for authentication, for instance. If you block a fragment of the internet, service providers or security service providers might not get a complete view of all the vulnerabilities that are there, and you might actually not reach your feed of security content. So splintering the internet itself will have effect on individual companies and enterprises and people's security. But we need to think about what it means collectively, also think about how to treat the risk as fragmentation as a security risk. So when you think about your own security mechanisms, then not only think about what can the internet do to myself, but also think, what can I do to keep that internet unfragmented? It's sort of a another type of risk that you have to take into account on national scale, on enterprise scale, and on individual scale. That's where best practices come in and so on and so forth. And with that, I want to ask my fellow colleagues at the panel to not take the assessment for granted that when we talk and discuss fragmentation on the internet, that is a thing that is going to happen. Because I think we should all resist that thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Olaf, and we'd like to invite you to take your seat as well for the panel discussion. Thank you. And now we're going to dive deeper into the presentation, into the topic of Splinternet. Moderating this panel discussion is Dr. Stephen Wong, Program Director and Associate Professor, Singapore Institute of Technology. And now please also welcome our panelists for the panel discussion. Seated already is Mr. Olaf, who also addressed us earlier. He is Principal, Internet Technology, Policy and Advocacy, Internet Society. Next, we have Mr. John Suffolk, President and Global Cybersecurity and Privacy Officer, Huawei. Next, Mr. Fernando Certo, Chief Technologist and Evangelist, Asia Pacific, Japan and China, Cloudflare. Last but not least, Mr. Lee Dolson, Chief Architect, Asia Pacific and Japan, Zscaler. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you. Right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this panel discussion. I think we have very esteemed panelists today. So what we'll do is we'll give them a bit of time to talk about the Splinternet. But I'll give Olaf maybe a rest since you have been standing for the last 10 minutes and go straight to John. John, you're CISO of Huawei, a great global company. And just now, I think Olaf did mention we shouldn't take the Splinternet, the assumption that it is here. But we also know in China, there's something, I think common knowledge is there's something called a Great China Firewall. So in your mind, is that really a Splinternet? And if it is, I mean, how is it impacting companies, your clients, businesses? And from a CISO's perspective, is that a cause for concern? Yeah, over to you.
Sure, thank you. So I start with Olaf's message that first of all, we shouldn't assume internet will split in any shape or form. And just because there may be variations of what we think is internet, it's not necessarily a split. And the reason why I would say that is because money talks. And the smaller we make the world from an e-commerce perspective, from an internet, the less competitive people can be. A smaller addressable market means smaller sales, less profit, and that's not the way the world has been built in the last 20 or 30 years. And China's a pretty good example of that. So the Great Firewall, from China's perspective, is not really an internet kind of debate. Let me just explain. So China really grew up in the 3G area. It doesn't really have a copper network. It grew up in the mobile area, started in 3G, expanded in 4, and if we think about 5G now, China already has more 5G base stations than the whole of Europe and America put together. It has 500 million people, just under, using a 5G device. There are 10,000 5G applications testing out how will a new technology work. China's economy is a digitized economy. So for them, things like the Splinternet would destroy the way that China has grown. When I work across the 170 or so countries in which we operate, customers don't talk to us about splintering anything. They talk about how can we retain our customers? How can we digitize? How can we, in essence, increase the amount of revenue per customer? How can we reduce our CapEx and our OpEx? And their number one priority is resilience. No network equals no money. Country goes down, costs a lot of money. Now, that message there about, network goes down equals no money is important. It's not, well, what happens if I have a security issue? I will prioritize security over a network availability. It's a commercial decision being taken in terms of the importance. If I don't have a network, I don't have enough money to fix security issues. So there's this challenge going on always in terms of organizations around the world, in terms of what their priorities are. So like Olaf, I don't see Splinternet being a significant issue. And if it is, I would just pose the basic question is, in your risk register, what is your risk register saying about if your network or your access to your applications goes down anywhere in the world? Because if you're not dealing with that, then you're not dealing with basic risk management. And the internet going down, which it does on occasions, telecommunications infrastructures around the world go down on occasions, cloud have issues on occasions, you need to cater for that. So I think it's not an issue that will happen, but bits of it might happen. But what will drive the world is commercialization and digitization, because that's where I think the future for most countries and companies are.
Right. Thank you. So you agree with all of that, actually?
Sadly, yes. Normally I try and disagree, but I do agree with Olaf.
So maybe we can move on to Fernando. I mean, from Cloudflare, because you guys deal with this, with cloud security, you look at reverse proxy. What is your view? Whether the Splinternet is an actual problem? Does it impact the way that we do security on the cloud space? I mean, let's hear your view.
So we haven't really seen a lot of it, right? We've seen, internet shutdowns, as Olaf mentioned before. And I think, for countries out there who are considering that, I think, one of the things that we need to take into account is that we all learn from each other, right? And we see, like, on our platform, we're present in 275 cities today, right? So we see types of threats emerging in particular parts of the world. And for any security vendor, and I'm sure you guys have the same type of approach, we learn from particular regions, and we're able to learn what's new, what we haven't seen before, and we're able to apply policies and security controls across the whole globe, right? As soon as we start to sort of see pockets of threats that we can't really learn from, people will still move around, right? And then all of a sudden we're going to start seeing new tools coming out that no one knew about, tools that are very, very mature, and types of threats that no one really knew about in other parts of the world. And all of a sudden the level of vulnerability that we have across the globe will increase significantly, right? And the difficulty of protecting assets online will certainly be a lot more prominent as well.
But I think back to that question is whether, in your view, do you think that the internet is something that is in existence, something that will happen, or is it something that is, as what Olaf mentioned?
Look, I think your question, John, about the Great Firewall of China. I think there's a lot of countries thinking of that, and I think that's more of a not necessarily segregating traffic to and from the country, and trying to change standards and have their own devices and their own protocols and things like that. But I think there's a lot of countries who are trying to control the narrative or control the messaging coming into their citizens, right? And rightly or wrongly, I'm not into geopolitics, but it is something that will cause. If you think of from a user experience perspective, right? There's still multinationals that operate in all these countries, and look at the difficulty that it is for for any organization to provide services for anyone who's based in China, right? And just the performance of applications crossing the Great Firewall of China, and just because of the sheer level of content inspection that goes through those devices, it's impossible for you to maintain multiple points of entry and exit in a country without any control and allowing information to flow freely. Right? And if you're talking about the proliferation of 5G into China, when anyone in China is trying to access anything outside of China, if you're on 5G or 3G or or dial-up, makes no difference, right? Because the performance traversing those devices is horrible, right? And we see lots of our employees in China. We have a large base of our employees in China that they struggle to get access to corporate information, right? Because of performance of those networks coming in and out of China. So as soon as we start to see that proliferation of tighter control and tighter trying to control the messaging and anything that comes in and out of the country, I think we're going to see not necessarily segregation, but certainly it will hinder the performance and the user experience for citizens in that country, right? And that probably doesn't impact the economy as much as to the same numbers as you were looking up when shutting down the internet for a day, but it will suddenly have a huge impact into anyone who's dealing with any sort of multinationals and things like that, right?
Thank you so much. So maybe we move down to Lee Dawson. I mean, coming from this girl, I mean, you're looking at zero trust. And is that in a way an instantation of what we call Splinternet? Because you don't trust essentially whichever is the network the user controls, the network controls, and thus you will see splinters coming up. Do we consider that as splinters? Do we think that that is a security concern, or is it good for cybersecurity actually?
I mean, in a way, I'm going to simultaneously fully agree and disagree with Olaf, and that's sort of where zero trust comes in, because the internet as a transport is wildly successful. Our ability to communicate around the world is incredibly successful, and there's no reason we should be looking at any things where we would start to make that work. We should be figuring out how do we embrace that to better interoperate, better work together. But where the internet has largely failed, and some of the security things that he just alluded to, is there's no security in the design. The design is, and I like to think, if you think about when it was invented, the guys who invented the internet were Star Trek fans. They were, and they were thinking, they were living in Gene Roddenberry's, we're all going to be living in utopia where there's no bad guys, right? In a way, I think they were, because it's just that was the time. This was all being defined at the time. Star Trek was probably what every geek was watching. And so there's no inherent security in the internet. Any endpoint can talk to any other endpoint. It's very easy to get an endpoint onto the network. And that's one of the challenges. And I think where I see splinternets happening in practice, like Olaf said, there's already, you can think of every enterprise, every government has a degree of a splinternet. To what degree is the networks you're already operating as your internal networks? Are they a splinter? I think, being here in Singapore, watching a government organization interact with its citizens, so I'm based here in Singapore, and Singapore had the internet separation that they announced a few years back because they recognized this really inherent security risk with how the internet works and did this whole internet separation project. But creating a splinternet, like let me take my network off of the internet, inherently, the genie's out of the bottle in terms of where we are. And then you're busy trying to find ways, how do I poke holes into that splinter to get users out, to get my applications out? How do I poke other holes on the splinter to get users back in? And inside that network, part of the reason for that, it's like, let me take this back to the 90s when my life was simple in the 90s. I didn't have this massive attack landscape. I built a network and my users were inside that, and I didn't worry about security. And that's what I feel like some of these splinternets are more like, can I go back to the 90s when life was easy? And you can't. The genie is out of the bottle, because if a user does find any of these ways inside that splinter, if we're still running a network like it's in the 90s, that means an attacker has wide open access to that network. We don't want to do that. So when we talk about zero trust, I want to take a user and use identity, and I want to talk, where are they going, who are they, what's the context of where they are. I want to use the internet and whatever networks are available to me to get the user to that application, but bring security into that at that lowest level. And I guess, going back, another point I wanted to make, when you think about internet separation and you think about Singapore, where, again, it's an interesting, the law of unintended consequences. What we've seen over the last few years in Singapore is this proliferation of applications that are now on the internet. And we have this thing called SingPass here in Singapore, where every single citizen and PR, we have identity that's able to connect directly to those applications. And I think part of the internet separation is what drove that. I can take all these government applications and I'm allowed to put them on the internet. So therefore my employees can do their jobs more effectively. But at the same time, Singapore's attack surface is massively expanded. And so what I'm talking about with these zero trust principles is I can take these applications off of the open internet, and I can use identity from the open internet, though, to connect those users to the applications in a secure way, and then provide the right level of security at the right time. Based on who is the user, what's the device they're coming from, what are the types of controls I want to put in place to ensure this application is safe and this user is safe.
Right. Actually, back to Olaf, so hopefully you have time to rest. I mean, hearing from Lee Dawson, I mean, in a way that we talk about digital identities and actually users being able to access part of the network and part of the networks being air-gapped or segregated. In your view, you don't view that as splinternets, or do you? And whether are those concerns or not? Because if you look at it, it's true. I mean, we do have air gaps and the assumed security that comes with that. In actual fact, people just go around it and things becomes worse. So, but it is happening. So I think back to your point is that the Splinternet is not assumed to be here. I mean, what's your view about that?
Right. So I'm going to go back to the sort of first principles again. These critical properties of the internet. One of the critical properties is a common protocol that we use on the internet. Well, that is already broken. We have IPv4 and IPv6, and IPv6 applications, only IPv6 applications cannot easily talk to IPv4 applications. So in that sense, there is already sort of a splintering going on. The problem is if we would be removing away from those critical properties with this IPv4 and IPv6 a transition, we're trying to move those together and we have a plan for the future, at least collectively in our minds. If it comes to enterprise security and your home security, you probably have a net box on your router which acts as a firewall, and you cannot set up a server within your home without jumping to loops. So in that sense, yes, you have a Splinternet. But the point is, we should not be removing from those principles further. We should actually try and move closer to them. Now, I fully agree that the internet itself is, by virtue of its openness, has a lot of things going on that you probably don't want to have in your door. And using zero trust principles to secure your own infrastructure and applications makes perfect sense. If you look at how security on the internet is designed, it's always designed with an enormous attack surface in mind and with the principle of trust nobody. So, zero trust was already a thing on the internet when it didn't have a name yet. But going back to those principles, try to keep close to the ideal is what I would argue for. Splinters are already there. That beam has already, things chopped off. What we want to be careful of is not to chop off more splinters, so at some point the beam might crack.
Yeah, so very good point there. Actually, one thing that, if I summarize it correctly, is if you look at it, there are splinters that's caused by technology inoperability or in the process of being interoperable. Like example, you mentioned IPv4, IPv6. I mean, there will come a time and there will be a push to make them interoperable, just like recently we were talking about Wi-Fi 6 and 5G, moving from one network to another. How do you transit? I mean, that might create a bit of friction technology. But back to also the point about zero trust and what you correctly mentioned. In the house, of course, in my house, that's my splinter, but who really cares? Because it's just me and myself. But as we grow that pod to be bigger, instead of just a house, it becomes an estate. Instead of an estate, it becomes a country. Then would that be a concern? And is that something that maybe back to yourself? I mean, because from Huawei's perspective, is that really a concern? I mean, from a security standpoint, because the way of zero trust, for example, if I'm looking at it from a nation's perspective, might be, right, I just trust no one, and I control the data that's coming in or out. I mean, is that something that you see really as a reality?
It is. We've touched on a number of points there, and one of them, the reality is, technology very rarely dies, and if it dies, it takes a hell of a long time to die. So we're suffering with legacy issues all over, our infrastructures, whether that's a country infrastructure or a company infrastructure or even in our own homes. But what's happening is that because we now have so much compute power at a low cost, we are layering complexity on complexity on complexity. And I think it's fair to say few, if anybody, has true visibility of the risks they're carrying in their complete infrastructure, whether it's at home, it's in the office, it's in your estate or your city or your country. And therefore, whether we like it or not, we're having to think about security at a very, very horizontal level. But you can't secure everything because that's not our starting point. And that implies, in essence, you understand what you do want to secure. You do want to be resilient because you're going to have to pick your battles. And to be honest, it's the same debate that's going on in terms of privacy now. Do I care that you actually can find out what's on my shopping list? I don't give a damn. But I do care if you know what my banking details are. And again, we're making selections here in terms of what we're protecting versus what we're not protecting. And I think it's going to get much, much worse. You know, I was talking, at this conference earlier about when you begin to look at the intelligent, vehicle, where you've got, inbuilt communications, you've got sensors talking to a mix of, 3, 4, and 5G. You're looking at what's going on around the vehicle. That might be going into someone's cloud. It might be going into a car manufacturing centers. That is a massive landscape. And you're not talking of one supplier, you may be talking of 1,000 suppliers. So the whole issue in terms of accountability, knowing who is doing what, that is the world we're in, and it's not going to get easier. So where I do think we have to think about is not so much on something like a splinternet, but it's understanding in essence, what are the things that are going to hurt me from a security perspective? What are my critical things that will either, create social unrest, for example, if people began to be killed by certain technologies, or just stopped working, I cannot get access to food or water or banking, those kinds of things, the standard critical infrastructures. That's where our energy has to go. And what's underpinning all of this is a communications network. Everything is talking to everything else. So I think our model in thinking about, challenges going forward has to think slightly differently. Less about the small tactical item and even the splinternet. It's the consequences of these things. Because if we understand the consequence, we can manage and think about how we will manage things. City goes down, node goes down, cloud goes down, what's my plan? And if we don't have answers to those questions, it is only a matter of time before something goes wrong. And that's not because people are bad people. We have seen networks goes down because of a certificate has expired. And it's taken 3 days for the company to find out where that certificate is. These things will happen. Can you imagine a city, which was a major European city, down for 3 days because of a single certificate? So that's the world we're in, and that's the way we need to think about, in essence, what is my plan B, what is my plan Z? And it's not about getting, down into the weed of is X slightly different to Y, because it was ever thus in technology. There's always been all of this stuff that we've had to maintain forever, and that isn't going to change.
Yep. So I think fundamentally, there's disruption to the internet that can be caused by multiple factors. Correct. But back to the splintering point, I think, and one thing they did mention is about the threat intel that you get, the visibility that you see from those, and seeing somebody having a vulnerability and you not knowing about it, and you suffer the same. I mean, maybe Fernando, you can have your comments on this as well.
I think, the zero trust conversation, I find it fascinating, right? I've been involved in that since 2014, but any type of network segregation that you think you can control an environment is a really false sense of security, right? And let's take, what happened with Log4j, for example, right? You don't need to download an exploit, right? All you need to know is how to write a payload. So that type of information you can pass over the phone, right? So how much segregation are you going to do, or how much of splintering are you going to do on a network to get to someone to say, you know what, if you make this request with that particular payload on a HTTP request, you can get access to anything on the network. And the organizations within that city or that country or that whatever that may be, they won't have that sort of threat intel and visibility, right? We were able to, we have about 35 million internet assets behind Cloudflare today. Out of that, there's 4.2 million free customers that have multiple assets, right? When Log4j came out, in a matter of hours, we were able to push that to every single one of these 30-something million properties, right? In deny mode, straight away, and the advice was, look, put all your assets behind Cloudflare, you don't need to pay $1, but while you're investigating what's happening and looking into what the damage could be internally on your own networks, right? And this is sort of the, from a threat intel perspective, the ability to protect and react to a vulnerability, but first knowing about the vulnerability and being able to react is the true risk of having segregations, right? And you look into, what happened to Uber, right? Like within their own splinter, within their own corporate network, right? Because of a vulnerable entry point, which was a person in this case, all of a sudden they can move laterally, and then there's all the vulnerabilities within that environment that no one's supposed to tap into, right? And I think if we go down the path of splintering networks, I think countries will suffer a lot more and states will suffer a lot more because of not being able to address these types of vulnerabilities in the matter that they need, right? And the speed that they need.
Yeah. So we do here actually splintering will cause that effect where actually you are in your own silos and you suffer certain things that others have suffered, and you all jointly together will be in a more serious problem. But this is interesting because if you look at zero trust, for example, this is all about trusting one person. In this case, you were mentioning Cloudflare, that everybody trusts you, and that's why you are the trusted source. But with zero trust, is what makes people trust that one single source. I mean, everybody will have their own inclination to say that, oh, actually, I just want to protect myself, and others is others, and everybody will be adversary to myself. So I'm not too sure whether, Lawson, you have seen this within the clienteles that you see when you are promoting zero trust, that everybody's thinking about protection of myself, but without consideration to others.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see some of that. A lot of this comes down to, if I'm going to put all my eggs in a basket with a vendor, then I have to look at, what is plan A, what's plan B? How is this vendor helping me? Do I need a plan C when plan A and B fail? And those are all things you have to explore. I guess when I talk about zero trust, and I agree with Olaf on standards, it's really not necessarily adopting a single vendor approach either. It's looking at, and when I say zero trust, I'm not talking about Zscaler's marketing. I'm talking about, let's look at NIST, and what is NIST defining on zero trust? And we start to see standard bodies trying to do what's interoperability. Because if I can have interoperability, I don't necessarily have to put all my eggs in a single vendor basket or thing like that. But example, if I'm adopting this zero trust situation, so I have this log4j, whether it's Zscaler zero trust or Cloudflare zero trust, if I had these things behind zero trust, I'm using identity before I can even touch that server. So if I'm a Chinese hacker that isn't part of the authorized group, I can't hit that server for log4j. I have to have identity first. That attacker would have to compromise identity. But then it comes down to, who is the arbiter of identity? How are we managing identity? Not just for users, but like you say, for machines, for OT. There's a lot of things to do when you think about all the applications of how do I manage identity in these different use cases.
I think, Lawson, you mentioned something about standards, which back to Olaf, which is interesting because we talk about standards as potentially one of the possibilities of mitigating. You still have splinters, but splinters that can intercommunicate in certain ways, right? But how do we push these standards, these policies? Because again, it's not an easy task. Everybody will look at what they want to protect, and the openness of this means that I'm exposing myself to more risk. So what can we do to promote these standards, these policies that will allow these communications to happen so that we are still in a zero trust environment and protect myself, but at the same time, we are able to share threat intel and so on and so forth?
That's a difficult question because I think we live in that world. We live in a world where we have those standards, where on a technical layer we have open processes to evolve the technologies that are involved. So I find that actually a difficult problem, a difficult question to answer. But I wanted to respond to something you said, which nagged me a bit. Because the thing that you said was, I don't care about my shopping list. And for me, that's just one of these examples where not caring about your shopping list might have unintended consequences. And I think that when we talk about Splinternet, about fragmentation, that those unintended consequences of choices that we make in one realm might actually cause the Splinternet. The reason why that example triggered me was, well, I don't care about my shopping list, but somebody who buys the morning after pill in some nations might.
Sure, and I accept that. But my point.
When you think about discussions like that, and you look at what type of interventions are taken for instance, digital sovereignty, then some of these interventions might be taking place just at the waist of the hourglass, on that layer of the network that makes the internet. And understanding that the interventions that you take actually impact and move you away from an open, secure, trustworthy internet, I think that's very important.
So
and now I'm going to make this shameless plug. Google for Internet Way of Networking Impact Assessment Toolkit, because that's something that we developed at the Internet Society to actually look at proposals and try to assess, based on a few criteria, what way are we moving? So that was my shameless advertisement.
John, before you respond, just for the audiences out there as well, we do have a Slido on. If you have questions that you would like to ask, yeah, please ask them, then we can ask the panelists. But now for the excitement part,
Thank
John.
you. My point really is, and I'm going to tie it into standards as well. If you look at the NIST SP range, it has over 200 individual standards, guidelines in there. You search for information security on the BSI catalogue, and there's 1,143 standards relating to information security. You're going to need to pick your fight, because you can't do everything. There is no company in the world, and most companies are not huge, that can read all the guidance, interpret the guidance, execute it across an organization that probably doesn't have many resources and much money. So my point about, my shopping list versus my bank account is about making informed choices. My argument about standards would be, the problem with standards is they're not standard. If you're a company and legislator, well, I'll give you an example. GDPR is, as a privacy, law, is up there, and people say it's the gold standard. Well, is it now? Because it isn't one thing. There are over 100 variations in the German interpretation of GDPR versus the base legislation. I don't know how many is in Holland in terms of variations. So if you are a vendor, if you are a service provider trying to comply with a law, which actually is different in every individual country, where do you think the big bosses are going to start making decisions of where they invest their money? And it comes back down to understanding, in essence, what battles do you want to fight? What standard do I want to adopt, which is the best standard for my industry? What guidance or law do I want to comply with? Or am I going to wing it a little bit on the law because the law is open to interpretation, and therefore I'll just spend my time in court? And I think the world that we're in is about understanding what business you're in, what battle you need to fight, and understand the consequences of those battles. Whether you're splintering off, whether you've got supply chain disruption, whether you have caused an unintended consequence, and the question would be, do you care about that unintended consequence, given that you're probably accountable to your shareholders, not somebody else's shareholders?
Yep. So we have some questions from the audience. If I could summarize all the questions, because actually all of them are asking about, one way or another, about the splintering of the internet because of governments coming into play and looking at whether they federate identity, whether they federate the content streams and so on and so forth within their countries. And that will create that splinter effect. So maybe back to Fernando. Do you think, what is your take on this? Because it seems inevitable. You have particular countries that's really promoting and actually saying that, well, instead of having a federated approach of doing this, we'll just control our own borders, and if you want anything, you come talk to us. And we still control ourselves. So a bit like what John was mentioning about, I'm worried about my own shopping list, not so concerned about what happens, how would my shopping list impact somebody else's. So maybe, Fernando, you can, from your perspective.
I think the biggest challenge for any government to enforce that and sort of, build walls around their infrastructure is like, I was talking about, the Great Firewall of China. There's heaps of ways of getting around it, right? And like we've been doing it for a while, right? Now we have a legal way of getting around it, but there's people will always try and find ways around it, right? And the people that suffer from all of this are the citizens, right? Companies will always figure out a way of doing it in some legal, some illegal, but they'll figure out a way of doing it, right? I think the fact that governments want to do that and they have to sort of deal with other governments, you're going to start having the same problem as I was mentioning before, right? That, there's threat intel, and we are focusing on security here, right? There's threat intel that doesn't really flow naturally from one country to another, but because of, whatever trade agreements they have, they will have some sort of connectivity, right? And this is sort of, will start becoming more and more of a problem because of knowledge and ability to look into, particular vulnerabilities, and the only people who are really going to suffer are the citizens of that country, right? And this is not even, going down the path of misinformation or, controlling the narrative or whatever that may be, but just purely from a security perspective. Now, just a quick comment on the standards. The challenge that you have with, I think NIST is fantastic, right? There's a lot of really good information there. There's a lot of really good guidance for organizations to protect themselves and governments to protect themselves. The problem is that when standards are not enforceable, they're not standards, right? They're guidelines. And I think the beauty, I think you guys will probably be in the same position as us, that most technology vendors are building solutions based on those guidelines, right? To enable organizations to, in a much more easier way, and governments to enforce some of these standards / guidelines from, the likes of NIST without having to really go through and read, 200 different documents from NIST, right?
Actually, now to lead off, and actually there's a very interesting question about identity, right? Which actually asks, is there a way for non-anonymous internet where we have a non-federated identity? Okay, so in a certain ways it's non-federated, but it's just based on agreements between governments or between nations. So, but it's non-anonymous, which means we know who is on the internet, right? The identity is based on a government and me making it known to another government who wants to cooperate with myself, right? Who this individual might be or who this business might be. Do you think that will work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a part of it. I think that's where, and I would still argue that that's federation, right? At the end of the day, you're picking for any given person who is managing the identity. It's almost like a financial services know your customer. And so Singapore is probably a little ahead of a lot of governments where they have this, SAML federated modern standard way for anybody who lives here in this country to be able to authenticate an SSO, not just into government apps, but many private apps. But I do imagine many other governments of the world are looking at that. And, I guess, there's things about that. Can you trust private enterprise to do it? You can't really trust Google or Facebook to do it because they don't really have really strong know your customer if you're looking at that. Governments make sense. Maybe financial services, there's an angle there because they're doing very strong know your customer. Because if you're trying to do that, yes, you need someone who's managing identity that you trust. And so government to government, that makes a lot of sense. It's not just a government to government problem though, because many governments are outsourcing lots of services to lots of suppliers, right? And so it is, how do I federate on top of identity? So I'm going to trust my supplier's identity because there's no point in trusting my supplier's 5 different governments that his employees work across, but I have to trust that supplier's identity. But there is an area of maturity we all have to come to because right now those identities are kind of siloed and we need to build, and I agree with Olaf, we're all moving together in the direction. Things are going in the right direction, but we need to move together. Like, how do I manage across those different federated identities, these frameworks to say, yeah, I'm the Singapore government and I outsource this to Huawei who's got contractors in China. How do I do that and make sure this guy can authenticate and I know this is this person from Huawei doing this, or this is a government interoperation where I got 2 different government agencies across 2 different countries. What are we doing to make sure the users can talk to one another across that framework? Again, using the internet, I don't need to splinter the internet itself because the internet's working great. I just need this identity overlay that can sit on top of this to make intelligent decisions and simultaneously reduce my attack surface. I don't want these applications just sitting in a DMZ where at the same time a Chinese hacker can go see is there a log4j or whatever the next new vulnerability is, right?
Yeah. Yep. So
that question didn't include Tor networks.
Actually, that's something that's very interesting that you mentioned. Actually, it's about communications, having a platform to really talk about these issues, have agreements. I mean, personal view-wise is that actually then the agreements between governments, a set of governments or set of nations may create that splinter, correct? Because you will have a group of governments that en blocs together versus another group of governments en bloc, and hooray, we have a splintering of identity. So just to conclude, I think we have all kind of agreed that splintering is an issue. It is going to be a problem, right? to which maturity or which state, how preventable it is, I think we have our own views. What are some of the concerns that it might cause, some of the issues that it might raise, what are some of the mitigations, be it in standards. But just to give maybe all the panelists maybe a minute to summarize your thoughts about splintering, whether it's here, whether it's not, what are the cybersecurity implications, and what should we do as one action item that maybe the audiences should take away. Maybe we start from Olaf.
Yeah, I think I already did my shameless plug in terms of, well, when you take your security decisions, whether that's on enterprise scale or a nation scale, take into account what the effect is of your decision or your non-decision on the internet itself, because that internet itself is also part of your value chain. So that is what I would summarize my
So don't think just about yourself, but also
Right.
think of what you are doing and how that impacts others.
Yeah.
Right, John?
and explain your shareholders if they don't.
Okay. I'm going to go in the opposite direction, I think. I don't know about the countries represented in this room, but in the UK, we can't get one country to agree on anything. Our chance is to get 200 countries to agree on a common step forward. It's not going to happen. So you have to focus on what you can do. You can't solve everybody else's problems. I'm afraid, we are just a teaspoon of water in the ocean. That's the reality. So the one thing I would do is, get the basics right. I would promote hygiene from a security all of the time. Because if you don't do the hygiene, all the great work that these guys and their companies do, it's completely dead in the water.
Right, Fernando.
Well, I should probably just say it's a bad idea, but look, I think it will happen, right? Same as John, I don't know, where each of you guys are from, but I'm sure that, there are countries who are seriously considering this. But, some of the conversations that we've been having with government entities now is around us sharing our threat intelligence with them. Right? Just think of the impact of, threat intelligence that's being fed to you that's incomplete, right? Because we're losing visibility on parts of the internet. So just from the ability to see what's new, vulnerabilities that no one knew about, not even talking about 0-day or anything like that, but, large exploitation of particular areas and industries, this is a massive risk for any country, right?
John, you wanted to...
Request. So if you share threat intelligence to a government who hacks one of my customers, can they sue you?
No. Well, they shouldn't really be making decisions based on a feed, right?
You've given them a known
It's
vulnerability,
intelligence.
and government has used it against, commercial organisations. I would have thought that's a legal
That's the problem.
minefield.
Imagine if the vulnerability came from a country that's splintered from the internet.
But this is where we get to, isn't it?
Yes,
There you go.
That's the thing. Right.
Yeah, I would say call to action. What I see is one of the biggest challenges. We talked about it earlier. You can't expect everybody to read NIST. And NIST is an American standards body. I mean, they're recognized internationally, of course, but there's no governments, or very few governments, that say, hey, just go follow NIST. I'm just stepping out. So what I do see is a lot of the compliance and regulatory is still stuck in quite a ways back. And so, investment in IT and technology tends to go with what the compliance says. And if the compliance says I need to invest in a firewall because the compliance hasn't been updated with some of the latest trends, that causes a challenge. It just causes the investments to go where you're not getting the best bang for your buck for security. So if there's a call to action at a government event, it is look at the regulatory, look at what is being done. In the United States, we see based on NIST and CISA, and there's executive order around that, but I'd like to see other governments around the world start to look at this, like, what are the things that make sense that the Americans are over there doing, and let's make sure, again, boil it down to just the basic stuff that can get implemented quickly and easily. I would also say privacy is really important. If you want to start being arbiters of identity, as a government, know your customer, maybe that's one of the best ways when you think about a lot of these common shared services. That privacy angle, I think, is also important. You want your own constituents, the people using that identity, to have faith in you that you are a safe provider of that. So it's something to think about from a regulatory and compliance as well.
Right. Thank you all for the pointers. And actually, we have talked about the Splinternets, and actually the difficulty is actually apparent within the panel. I mean, we are talking about consensus or standards. I mean, even within the 4 panelists, we can see diversion of views, let alone when you're talking about hundreds of nations. It is an issue. I think the Splinternet is something that as you all mentioned, it will occur one way or another. It's just how you define the splinters. Back to John's point, it is a big problem. I mean, as we are discussing this, but one thing that I do take away actually is fight your battle, which battle you want to fight. And because we all have limited resources, there's not so many things we can agree upon. What is the thing that we want to agree upon and how to get the nations to come together to talk about that? I think that's something that we can take away, and hopefully all the audiences, be it from your company's perspective or from a nation's perspective, what is that one thing that you really want to talk to everybody else so that we can mitigate the splintering of the internet and the security risk that comes with it, right? So with that, thank you so much, the panelists, for all your insightful sharing. Thank you all the audiences for your attention during this period. And let's keep the conversation going. The conversation is not closed. It's definitely a debatable area. And hopefully we have more conversations after this. Thank you so much. Thank you.
A big thank you to our esteemed panelists for the very engaging discussion. I'm sure our participants from all over the world have gleaned lots of insights on the topic of mitigating the cybersecurity risks of Splinternets. So we have come to the end of this SICW session. Internet or Splinternet, implications on securing the digital future. We thank you for being here with us. I just wanted to remind you that you can revisit this session on the SICW platform. It's going to be there all the way till 18th November, so you can watch this live stream over again. I want to remind everybody as well that at 3 p.m. in the studio, that's when Women in Cyber 2022 will take place. So if you want to come for that, please be early. We have a minister who's going to be making a guest appearance for that session. Have a good one, everybody. Get some refreshments, and we'll see you back here at 3 p.m. Bye.